Welcome to Behind the Numbers. Today we're talking about how to navigate ethics around social media at work. And we all know social media can be a minefield. For professionals, the territory comes with even more risks. So at a time when viewpoints about pretty well everything seem to become ever more polarised, and even professional sites like LinkedIn are struggling with how to handle divisive discussions, how can accountants stay within their ethical boundaries online?
Don't go down a negativity, even if you think, you see someone, it's the morning after the Oscars and someone's wearing a dress and you think, what on earth were you thinking? You just sort of think, well, they chose it and leave them to it. There's nothing positive that comes out from having negative messages like that, even if they're totally personal.
When I said I was leaving to start up my own business, they all said, Hannah, you're going to have to be the face of the business and put yourself out there because people will buy into you. And that was never my plan. And actually that doesn't work if you're setting up a business. So, that's where the lines do get blurred.
We do encourage our staff to use social media, but we have some major rules and they need to be mindful of the tone. We want them to sound professional, not preachy or insincere.
I'm Philippa Lamb and I'm joined remotely by Junaidy Ab-Mutalib, Managing Partner of JM & Co, Chartered Accountants in Kuala Lumpur. In the studio, we have Lucy Penrose, Director of Ethics, Risk and Compliance at RSM UK, and Hannah Macdonald, prolific social media user, co-founder and Managing Director of Accountancy Hub. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
Now, very usefully, Junaidy and Lucy have been working on a discussion paper on this subject specifically to help chartered accountants understand what is expected of them. So I think I'm going to start by asking you two for some war stories. Where do accountants tend to go wrong with social media, Lucy?
I would say it's maybe sometimes being a bit over-enthusiastic in terms of the information that they give out. So we had some examples where junior members of the team shared a slide deck of some deliverables for a client engagement, not realising that, other competitors could see the information and that was giving away sort of trade secrets. Also, there can be a bit of a line in terms of, the difference between professional and personal posts, and people sometimes get it wrong. At a place I used to work, there was a member of staff that made a comment on the Daily Mail with some kind of ableist language, and someone tracked them down and found that they were working for my former employer and then contacted the CEO. So those are just two.
And how did that play out?
Well, when you go up to the CEO, it goes down the chain pretty quick. I think it got a lot of people having to look into it to understand what had happened, what had been said, and where there was an issue. It was someone that had made a post on the Daily Mail, but they had connected it to their Facebook, and then that Facebook profile said exactly where they worked. So, if it's that clear, if it's that obvious, then it can be quite tricky for people to sort of hide behind anonymity.
Junaidy, are these the sort of things you run into yourself in your own work?
Basically, accountants are generally very careful people because that's the nature of our job. But when it comes to social media, I've seen some that have gone terribly wrong. Yeah, I think one of the common example is the blur line between the personal and professional boundaries. It's very easy to forget that what we post on social media is in our personal capacity that might reflect ourselves as professional. So maybe that's a casual tweet after a busy week or complaint about clients can do a real damage to our profession.
And it's not just words, is it? It's images as well, image sharing. All sorts of unintended consequences from just letting something slip into an image that you post.
Yeah, even just things in the background. It could be a post about, I've just got my ICAEW certificate, I've just qualified, but maybe there's something in the background that other people might be able to spot, some sort of secret or something about their location that maybe they aren't supposed to be sharing. So it's more than you might think on the face of it.
I think we all got a bit more alive to this, didn't we, during the pandemic, thinking about our backgrounds, working remotely with cameras, all that sort of thing. But it's easy to let it slip, isn't it? And as you say, the implications for client data, particularly, they're really serious.
Yeah, I mean, there can also be sort of other examples where people are posting that they're attending certain events and maybe they've phoned in sick and you can kind of get caught out that way.
Ah, yeah.
I also seen some situation where somebody posted a photo in the Instagram, a photo of their workstation. I mean, innocently enough, but in the background you can spot the client files, the spreadsheets on the screen, and even handwritten notes with some sensitive information. Yeah, so I mean, it's easily done, but the risk is massive.
There are no hard and fast rules about this, but I mean, are there groups? Have you found there are groups who are more likely to make errors than not? I mean, we think about, fresh entries to the profession perhaps not being so aware of the protocols, but of course, younger people are more, tend to be more prolific users of social media. So what's your feeling on that?
I think that it's hard for trainees to make the transition from school or university into, the workplace and then being a professional accountant, even a trainee accountant. We have to abide by ethical principles. And they need to understand that, your ethical principles don't disappear when you leave the office. They stay with you. And I think a lot of social media, it can be a very quick thing. I'll just send this picture, I'll just send this post, and there's not a lot of thought behind it sometimes. But actually, as we've discussed, it can harm the profession as a whole. And as accountants, we're held to a much higher level than the rest of the population, and rightly so. So I think, I guess it's just that education piece for people that are entering the profession that we do have to be a little bit more careful.
Yeah, I mean, Lucy, as Hannah says, it's generally unintended. Are there particular platforms where people run into problems?
In my experience, LinkedIn is one of the trickiest because it kind of is a bit of a balancing act between the professional and the personal. So I think people tend to know that, Instagram, Facebook are more about you as a person, whereas LinkedIn is more connected to your professional life. So I think that LinkedIn is the one that people sometimes forget about in terms of, posting. They just kind of, as I gave the example earlier, they might post things like client deliverable decks. And they don't necessarily think about other people might see it in the same way that you maybe would for Instagram. I do also think, just picking up on Hannah's point, that we do also see sometimes people make the mistake that don't post on social media very often. So the younger demographic may be more au fait with social media, but it's possible that a slightly older group of people might not think about what they're posting quite the same way.
Yeah, I do wonder, going back to LinkedIn, I think you make a very interesting point there, because LinkedIn, I think it's fair to say, used to be entirely specifically work and business related. And that has really shifted in the last few years, I think, hasn't it? I mean, this is only my own perception of it, but it certainly seems people are bringing a lot more of their own personal opinions to it. And as you say, people who perhaps might not think of posting on X or on Instagram gravitate to LinkedIn. Imagine it's a safe space for them to say whatever they want to say in a work context, and perhaps aren't thinking quite as much as they should about the potential pitfalls there.
Definitely, and I think we have seen that shift on LinkedIn, people being very authentic and, even sharing pictures of their family and things like that. And that's happened since COVID. And I think, that's not a bad thing at all. It's good. We're all humans. It's nice to see the human side of people. But it's just, I guess, being mindful that we have these ethical principles, so you still need to think about confidentiality, as we've said, not sharing confidential information, whether that's to do with clients or colleagues. But I think you can still be authentic at the same time.
Junaidy, I think the difficulty a lot of organisations face is that obviously as organisations and indeed as professional individuals, people use social media for professional purposes. It's the commercial world we live in. They promote themselves and their work on social media. So there's no avoiding this, is there? I mean, how should organisations navigate that line? How should a code of ethics kind of limit professional behaviour in that space?
Turning into a more positive side, yes, social media can be a brilliant promotional tool. Yeah, I mean, firms and individuals are using it to raise their profile, share insight, and connect with clients in more human way. That's great, but the key is consistency, clarity, and compliance. Yeah, and not to portray inflated image of success and overstated their capabilities. Yeah.
Okay, so don't oversell your organisation.
Yeah, for me, it's like embedding the culture, the social media practice into a firm culture is very important. Yeah, it's never enough. Yeah, it's not enough to say be sensible online. You got to discuss it actively with the team. Yeah, and also to relate to ethical consideration as professional accountants. I think one way that we are having is like, to have a training session, especially during induction to new staff. We create a space for questions and treat it as part of our wider communication strategy, for our firm. So it's just like making social media feel just like another professional skills, one that needs to be understood and used thoughtfully by everybody of the firm.
So, Lucy, how common is that? I mean, this sounds like a great idea that you're teaching everyone under the roof. This is another business skill. But my guess is That's not universal.
No, I mean, I think it's probably fairly rare for it to be a priority of a firm to have social media sort of very, very high up the list when people come and join. In my firm, we have like a computer-based training module which includes a bit of consideration of social media. I mean, one of the things that Junaidy and I found when researching our paper was actually the ICAEW does have a lot of resources. There's lots of articles about social media. There's lots of, I think, Junaidy, you may agree that there was a lot more than we expected in terms of resources for our people.
So we can certainly point to those in the show notes for the episode. That sounds like they'd be very helpful. Getting into specifics, what exactly is expected of accountants by the ICAEW in this arena?
So one of the things that came in with the new ICAEW Code of Ethics 2025 was some enhancements with regards to professional behaviour. And one of the biggest things, this went through consultation, was that there was something added that talks about behaving in a manner consistent with the Professions Responsibilities Act in the public interest in all professional activities and business relationships, and to avoid any conduct that the accountant knows or should know might discredit the profession. So there is a line between the personal and the professional. However, I would say that final point about discrediting the profession doesn't get you off the hook, as it were, from an individual's perspective. The ICAEW recognises that there is a difference between our professional lives and our personal lives, and they won't necessarily take action in respect of something in your personal life. However, there may come a point where if they're doing something which is so egregious that could be relevant to their membership.
This brings us to a kind of cultural perspective, doesn't it? Which, in today's terms covers a very wide spectrum of issues indeed. As Hannah says, we all have our views about everything, and it's great that we can bring our whole selves to work and discuss those things. But there is this dividing line, isn't there, between what you might personally think or believe or want to talk about and what you should be doing online while you're, as it were, representing your organisation. Do you feel, Hannah, that's thoroughly understood?
I think it's really tricky. And since starting up Accountancy Hub just over a year ago, my personal brand and my business brand are completely interwoven. And actually, when you're starting a business, it is mainly you and your face and your journey and what you're trying to achieve.
So what guidelines do you set for yourself then around that? Because that is a tough line to navigate, isn't it?
I take the ethical principles very seriously. So they're always in the back of my mind. I'm very careful before I post something. I try and think about it carefully while staying human and authentic. And I try not to engage in negative commentary and anything that might be offensive or abusive. And obviously you can also report things like that to the social media platforms.
Because you're working in the EDI space, I think I'm right in saying. So presumably you are commenting on stories in the mainstream media that pertain to that. Have you had pushback? Have you had trolling from that?
I have, and it's really interesting because it's always when I'm commenting on cultural news or EDI news that I do get some negativity, not towards me, but towards, the topic in discussion. And that's when I have to make the decision, do I engage in that debate or do I step back? And often, I tend to just leave it because everyone is entitled to their opinion, and it's good to have a conversation about these topics most of the time anyway. But I do know other people who are accountants who actually, they're harassed personally, and that's very different. And that's where I think you do need to report.
Yeah, Lucy, you must have come across this.
In my role, I must admit, I don't do that much posting on social media. I live by a little bit of a rule of anything I write, I'd have to be happy for all of members of my family to see. I mean, it is also linked a little bit to my role. I'm in a non-client facing role, so I'm not sort of promoting myself in the way that a lot of accountants may be. I do definitely agree with Hannah in terms of don't go down a negativity. Even if you think, you see someone, it's the morning after the Oscars and someone's wearing a dress and you think, what on earth were you thinking? You just sort of think, well, they chose it and leave them to it. There's nothing positive that comes out from having negative messages like that, even if they're totally personal. So yeah, I'm maybe not the best person to ask because I tend to stay quite quiet when it comes to social media.
Well, you're understandably cautious. Obviously, as you say, this is your area, so you know the pitfalls. But I am wondering, would the best advice be for all accountants to keep their channels separate, their professional social media channels? Obviously, difficult for Hannah to do because she kind of is her own business. But for most people employed by others, is it better if you never post anything personal on a channel that you're using for work-related posts?
It's definitely an option. The only thing I would say is that if you're posting things which could be offensive, it doesn't necessarily take away any kind of responsibility in terms of your role as an ICAEW member, say.
So if you were connected to your organisation, even if you were posting privately, it would still be an issue?
I think so. Even if you were posting under a completely false name and you're using a VPN to scramble your location, if it could be traced back to you, I think that there could still be that point about discrediting the profession if you're being so rude.
Junaidy, what do you think?
I think if you are active on social media, and particularly as a professional voice, I think at some point you will encounter some negativity. These negative comment, critiques, and even genuine misunderstanding can be viral. Yeah. So I think the best approach is not to engage emotionally. Yeah. To stay calm, respond factually if it's warranted, and if it crosses a line, I will just block, mute, and report. Yeah, I would think that our reputation is very valuable. Yeah, not to be dragged into such arguments.
I do wonder if we talk about these things enough in a workspace, because it tends to be a very personal matter, doesn't it? Whether you post, comment, respond, like, don't like anything you see online. Is there enough discussion with line managers or colleagues about how you're engaging in these conversations? Because I think we all accept it's a necessary part of business in many ways nowadays, but how you do it still seems to devolve largely on the individual in the moment, doesn't it? Which is a problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I think social media, it's so fast-paced and things, change, new platforms pop up, old ones disappear. It's hard to kind of stay on top of all the different functions or functionalities of all the different options. A few years ago, I remember saying to one of my trainees that if I see you on social media in the office, then I will take your phone away. At that point in time, there was no business reason for them to be on social media.
Very different now, as Hannah can attest. Presumably you're all over this all the time, Hannah.
I am, yeah. And I remember because I was working in practice, which is where I trained, and then I stayed there a few years after. And when I said I was leaving to start up my own business, they all said, Hannah, you're going to have to be the face of the business and put yourself out there because people will buy into you. And that was never my plan. It was all going to be, just about what we do as a company. People would never see me. And actually, that doesn't work if you're setting up a business. People do buy into you and your brand and who you are. So, that's where the lines do get blurred, but it's just having those ethical principles at the front of your mind.
So I wonder whether we can draw out some useful threads of what organisations should be saying to people when they join about this. What would your advice be, Lucy?
I think just to be very mindful about anything that you post. Maybe think about, you can draft it and then send it later when a little bit of time has passed, particularly if it's something that's very current. If in doubt, ask someone within your team or within the wider organisation.
Should there be a consent process? It sounds clunky, but...
It's tricky. I know that, some organisations every social media post will go through their branding team, and that works for some. However, if you're, quite large, it can be, a bit of it can be quite tricky to get it through all the different levels, and it gets changed potentially beyond recognition to the point where maybe the original point just disappears and it's quite a nothing post. So I do think it's worth organisations thinking about how they want to, do they want to be an organisation that's commenting on current events, or do they want to be a little bit more sort of stand back and see what happens and where can our sort of commercial opportunities come, and then only post if there's a sort of a commercial drive. And that's for every organisation to decide on their own. But I definitely think that for the sort of the younger, the newer members of the organisation, to be quite careful about representing themselves and representing the firm. They are not warriors for the firm. There are people that some organisations have sort of social media teams and new graduates may not necessarily be the right messengers of whatever those teams want to say.
Junaidy, it's complex, isn't it? Because that dividing line between where legal and compliance teams might think it's going to be so great if no one posts anything that our team doesn't see first, and the world as it is now, Hannah's world, where engaging is part of the business, and that just doesn't work anymore. You can't be like that because everything happens in real time.
I think it's important, to have a social media policy because using social media as a marketing tool is unavoidable in today's world. So what we have in our firm, we want to keep things very simple, clear, and practical. So we do encourage our staff to use social media, but we have some major rules. We don't allow them to discuss client matters online. They always need to check the facts before sharing any financial news, to avoid any political commentary from our firm's accounts. And they need to be mindful of the tone. We want them to sound professional, not preachy or insincere. And of course, if they are ever in doubt, they need to exercise caution and consult a senior colleague.
So this is them posting on your company account. What about posting on their own personal accounts?
On their personal account, yes, we have some guidelines as well given to them. They can post anything that relate to their personal, but not anything to do with our firm. There's a boundary, a clear boundary that we define the boundary, and clearly we inform them during their induction.
So do you have anything to say to them about what they might choose to post on their personal accounts in the arena of, say, politics?
No.
So they can do what they like?
Because we want to keep it simple.
Right.
It's up to them. They should know the boundaries.
What does everyone think? Does that sound like a reasonable approach? It's quite loose, isn't it?
It is, but I think it's probably reflective of quite a few organisations. It's tricky. The more rules you put in, the more gaps people find. So, having a principles-based approach, particularly around social media, I think makes sense. One place I used to work were quite strict about when you set up a Facebook account, you shouldn't log anything about where you're working currently. Where I work now, that's not the case. So it does vary a little bit. But yeah, it is quite tricky, and I think that it's something that firms aren't necessarily giving that much time to until something goes wrong.
Yes, and then it's firefighting, isn't it? So perhaps better if organisations get out in front of this. I mean, Lucy, you think about this a lot. I'm guessing that you take the view a principles-based policy, as it were, is going to be better than pages and pages and pages of protocols that no one's ever going to read anyway. So it does come down to quite simple things, as you say, about professional constraints, about your own personal ethics, that sort of thing. But should a company be handing their new employees a list of those?
No, I think the principle-based approach is good, and I think just by doing the ICAEW Chartered Accountancy qualification, you learn about business law, and there is a legal side to this.
Yes.
You shouldn't defame anyone on social media. There are intellectual property rights. You shouldn't share things that are owned copyright-wise by someone else. And I think you do pick that up through the qualification itself.
Along with the ethics training, of course.
Along with the ethics training.
Well, it's a sprawling subject, and I don't think we can say that we've got our arms completely around it on this occasion, but I think we've aired quite a lot of the issues. Lucy, for people who are thinking perhaps they need to do more in this area for their organisation, as you say, ICAEW has a lot of resources. Where would they start?
If you do a search on the ICAEW website for social media, that will bring up a good number of articles which have got some helpful content which include ethical considerations.
And so you could actually start your work in forming a policy if you don't have one right there from there.
Yes, I would recommend that. The problem with going from the Code of Ethics or the ICAEW Code of Ethics is it's all very kind of high level and it can be a little bit legalistic language. So I think that the articles around the topics are more sort of user-friendly.
Junaidy, did you have any particular favourite you'd recommend to newcomers to this arena?
I refer a lot to ICAEW website. There's a lot of useful information and resources on the web. Well, you have like sample policy. They are like a simple case study. And of course, our code of ethics. We apply the principle of code of ethics in preparing the policy for the social media for our firm. It's all about applications.
And Hannah, perhaps just to wrap this up, is the final thought. Everyone needs to think about this maybe a bit more than they are at the moment.
It does come back to those ethical principles, but when you're trying to be authentic online, show your personal brand, it is difficult and no one's perfect. I'm sure I've made mistakes and got things wrong. But I think we've just got to be very careful, check ourselves and ask others for feedback as well and say, what did you think of that post? Was that okay? If you're working for an employer and you're worried about something, maybe pass it by your manager or something before you post it. I'm in a very different situation. I am the company, but I do think we need to sometimes get a second opinion.
Think before you post.
Think.
Thank you very much, everyone. Really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll be going through the new Code of Ethics in more detail on the next Accountancy Insights, along with professional judgment and HMRC's attempts to tackle tax debt. The next Behind the Numbers will be our 100th episode. Obviously, we'll be bringing you a bumper edition to celebrate, so don't miss that one. If you subscribe to the podcast and you turn on notifications, we'll let you know every time a new episode drops. As you may know, listening to these podcasts counts towards your CPD. And of course, we always appreciate likes and comments from listeners. Thanks for listening.